workshop this morning is about domestic work, about welfare, about money for women, especially for women. But we believe strongly, and we want to prove it this morning, that money for women is money for everybody, except those who now have all money. The Wages for Housework began as an international campaign in 1972. And one thing that it immediately established is that there was work going on that nobody was paying attention to, and that was not carrying a wage. That is, the people who did that work did not get a pay packet or a check or anything, or in fact, yes, that's right, anything, at the end of the day, week, month, year, life. And then we noticed, at least we insisted on others noticing, that that work, that caring work, was actually the basis of society. It was the industry that lay beneath every industry, because we made the entire working class, which is not irrelevant considering that we live in capitalist society. Now, the first person who understood that this has implications not only for, quote, housewives or, quote, mothers, but for domestic workers, was a woman named Clotilde Walcott from Trinidad. And she met the Wages for Housework campaign in Europe, and she said, this is what I need, and went back to Trinidad and formed the National Union of Domestic Employees. The acronym is NEW. And they certainly undressed what was happening to domestic workers. And she passed a few years ago, and we always call her name to remind people, those of us who care about this in particular, that we have predecessors, that we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before. Now, since we began as the Global Women's Strike in the year 2000, coordinated still by the the International Wages for Housework campaign, we went a lot further because we have been involved in all kinds of struggles, because the fact that women do not get money for our work, which we continue to do whatever else we are doing, has implications for every area of our lives. We are the poor sex internationally, and in every sector the women have less than the men. That is, those of us who are not the 1%. I'm talking only about the 99%. The 1% do not concern us, except as the source for what we want. We went further in the sense that we said not only do we make the whole working class, but we are responsible for the reproduction of the human race. Now that can't be marginal. And yet we are treated in marginal ways. We are treated financially, socially, and in every way. The work that we do, reproducing the human race, is not counted. And the reason that that is so is precisely that we live in a capitalist society for which that is not the end and aim. Profit is the aim. I'm sure, speaking to people of the left, this is not a new and difficult concept. But when we realize that the position of women is precisely founded in the drive for profits where people don't matter, then those who reproduce people don't matter either. Okay? So that is our starting point. And this morning, we want to go into the implications for fundamentally two struggles. Now, last night I was at the plenary and they talked a lot about ideas, but they didn't say much about the struggle. They said almost nothing about the struggle. And yet we know that that struggle is now the struggle for survival, not merely in third world countries, which are the overwhelming majority of the countries of the world, but also in the so-called developed countries, the industrial countries. Our struggle now is not only to change the world, but to change the world because our survival is dependent on changing it. And for this audience, I don't think I need to say too much about that. So I'm going to tell you who will be your speakers this morning. Lady Mozambique was to be our first speaker from Peru, and because of illness, she could not take the plane. But the woman from London who works closely with her, mainly by Skype, is here to speak, Nina Lopez, who was herself from Argentina, based in London, and she will speak about Lady Mozambique's work with the Domestic Workers Union in Peru. The second speaker is Pat Albright, who is a domestic worker and a welfare rights campaigner who will tell you what is happening as a domestic worker and what is happening as a welfare rights campaigner. Our third speaker is Pat Gowens, who is the leader, point of reference, initiator of Welfare Warriors, which is an organization in Wisconsin, and I think you have one or two other places as well. She'll tell you about that. But it has stood for welfare, and with women at the bottom for years in a militant and very imaginative and creative way, and she'll tell you more about it when she speaks. The fourth is Nancy Carroll, the third will be Nancy Carroll, who is a community activist and a member of Every Mother is a Working Mother. Pat Gowens will follow her. And the final speaker is Sam Weinstein from Payday Men's Network, who is part of the Utility Workers Union of America, a trade unionist who was assistant to the president for some years until his retirement, speaking on the connection, which is absolutely profound, between welfare and wages. And before I give over to the speakers, I notice a t-shirt here which is delightful. $15 minimum wage. Yes, would you stand up, please? And oh, yes. I beg your pardon. I forgot half my speech, but she reminded me. One of the things that Pat Albright will be speaking about will be a welfare petition that is now been launched by the Global Women's Strike. And it speaks to, I just mentioned this, a bill that has been before Congress, which, if passed, and that's a great struggle, would move us forward. We're not waiting until they pass it, believe me. We haven't got that many years in life. But I want to have a say about the petition, which I don't seem to have. A copy of the petition from London. We want...
No, that's the wrong one.
We're entirely organized. There's a lot of work to do. In London, we wanted we want this petition, let me just explain this. We want this petition ultimately to be in every country, a form of this petition in every country. And in our network, which is international, but a few close countries like India, Peru, etc., we cannot say, as we say in the United States or in the UK, the military has the money, we want it. Because we want this money to come, first of all, from military budget. Our slogan is, invest in caring, not killing. You notice that when you have a little expense like welfare or disability benefits, there's a big problem. But if you have a big machine that will kill a lot of people, there's no discussion. They just spend the money for that. And we have noticed, and we do point to it. But we want those third world countries to demand that all the money that comes in aid and loans go first of all to the carer, because then they won't go to the military. And that will be part of what we internationally will be campaigning for. But in London, we decided finally, after a lot of discussion, to initiate the following petition: invest in a caring society, a living wage for mothers and other carers. And it's quite important that I mention this petition because the caring work that women do in the society is not limited to their families by far. We are the carers. We are largely the teachers, especially of young children. We are the nurses overwhelmingly. We are the care workers mostly. The others, if they're men, are usually immigrant men who are also lower in the wage hierarchy. But fundamentally, women have been the carers, and it is the recognition of all that caring work which we are demanding, which is another way of saying we want the whole perspective of society to change, so that it is not profit which is the end and aim, and we, the human race, are dispensable, but that the carers come first because the human race is indispensable, and that this, what we need as human beings and as relationships and as a society must be the end and aim of production, distribution, science, etc. So we say invest in caring and a living wage for mothers and other carers. Okay, that's where we're coming from. Now we turn to those who are making particular struggles, bearing this direction, this strategy in mind. And so I call on Nina Lopez to speak on behalf of Lady Mozambique in Peru.
Okay, hi, I prefer to stand. My voice doesn't carry unless I stand. So, I'm very sorry that I'm the one who has to speak today, because I would much rather have had Lady speak for herself and her organization. She's a fantastic organizer, and this is her picture, which you can have a look at in this book, which is the anthology of Selma's writings. There is a picture with Lady, who is part of our international network, and you can see from the photo the kind of absolutely determined person that she is. Now, the domestic workers in Peru, like in many other countries, have been organizing pretty much since really since the 80s. And in Peru, there's about 500,000 domestic workers. You know, it's not really known exactly, obviously, because you're not counted as a worker, and therefore it's very hard to know. But there's at least 500,000 workers who work in so-called domestic service. And in fact, they always say that it's the biggest employer of women there. which just gives you a sense of just how many women work as domestic workers. And of the 500,000, or it could be 700,000, you know, I've heard both figures, about 95% are women. And it's mostly indigenous or rural women who have come from the countryside to work in the city. And it is also very often children. And there's always a big debate going on when you go to the ILO and the various UN conferences about how children should not be working, which of course there is a huge movement of children, including in Peru, and many of them are in domestic service, who are against the regulations about children not working, because you just, you know, if you don't work, you can't survive, and your family cannot survive, and that is the situation as it is. So unless you're addressing the question of poverty and the question of whether the mothers are actually getting a living wage to support their children, you know, what are the children supposed to do? The UN doesn't tell you that. So many of domestic workers have started as children. Many, in fact, were kidnapped. There were a whole set of women who spoke, who were part of ladies' organization, who had been literally stolen as children from the countryside, very often by people coming to the countryside and telling the parents that they were going to give the children an education. And of course, the parents who are not in a position to support their children and want the best for their children, feeling, okay, it's a terrible heartache, but somehow I'm doing the best for my child by allowing these people to take the child with the promise of an education, and you then of course find yourself basically as a child slave. And all the people that I ever knew who were part of ladies' organizations will then tell you how they were told their parents were dead, and therefore this was now their family, and as a result of that, basically they had no rights. They were just supposed to do whatever they were told by these so-called parents. And it was really, you know, it's always a horrendous situation. A lot of rape and sexual assault, etc., as you can imagine. Now, in the 70s, there was a big liberation theology movement, which I think also has got a bit forgotten. But people like President Aristide in Haiti, for example, who was a priest, came out of that movement. There was a big movement of priests who said, okay, God loves everybody the same, but we are prioritizing the poor. And they really supported the movements, the grassroots movements that were going on in the various countries, especially in Latin America. And some of them, like the ones that I've met in Peru, actually helped domestic workers. They were with priests and nuns. And they actually went to like schools and places like that to find out, to seek out the people who were domestic workers and what their situations were and where they were being kept there by force or because they didn't know their rights and they didn't know they could leave those families. And often also it was a question of making sure that the children got the education they were entitled to, because children were supposed to go to school. And of course, these various employers would find ways of not sending the children to school because they just wanted them to be working for them. And it was, those priests and nuns were very instrumental in Peru to the first domestic workers organizations happening. And they helped women to escape, and then they just, you know, some of those women formed those first organizations, which then joined unions, and then when there was the dictatorship of Fujimori in Peru, which went on for about 10 years and was very, very bloody, and a lot of trade unions were persecuted, so I know a number of domestic workers who were points of reference in the movement, who were actually assassinated by paramilitaries. And others kind of changed the names of their organizations so that they became more like women's organizations as opposed to trade union organizations. They had always been women, obviously, but they changed their names so that they didn't look, so that they couldn't be targeted by the government so easily, and they could carry on organizing. Now the situation obviously has now changed in Peru, and Fujimori is in jail. You know, you don't see people here in the United States go to jail who were presidents. So, but Fujimori did end up in jail after a very long struggle and a lot of deaths.
Yeah.
So they have formed trade unions. You know, Lady is the General Secretary of a Federation of Trade Union Organizations. And
of domestic
workers. She herself was a domestic worker for many, many years. She still does some domestic work, but she was a domestic worker. She's now in her 50s, and she was a domestic worker from when she was about 16, I think. And they have won, the domestic workers organizations internationally have won the ILO convention, the first ILO convention to recognize domestic work as work and domestic workers as workers. And that was passed, it's the ILO Convention 189, and that was passed in 2011. And it really took decades of organizing internationally to get that victory. It was just a fantastic victory. And I remember when Lady called me from the ILO in 2010, right, in 2010, because that's when it was first discussed, and it was clear that if it went ahead in 2010, it would be passed in 2011. She was ecstatic. She was really ecstatic. And one of the comments also that she made, the convention recognizes, you know, an 8-hour day, a weekly paid day off, paid holidays, the right to education, redundancy money based on length of service, etc. So it's a good basic protection. And so far, it has been ratified by Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Germany, Guyana, Mauritius, Italy, Nicaragua, Paraguay, the Philippines, South Africa, and Uruguay. I think those are all the countries. The United States does not appear there. Neither does the UK. Okay, although Pat will say something about the victories that have been won in the US despite that. So what people are now campaigning for is the ratification of the convention, but also its implementation, because, you know, we all know about laws being there and what happens to them. And in fact, Peru has legislation since 2003. Okay, so like nearly 10 years before the convention, which already agreed to a whole set of these rights, except that it's just not implemented because the employers are not registered and they just do what they like, and the government doesn't want to put pressure on them. So it's a very dire situation. But the people themselves, you know, the movement itself has been very strong. And I just want to mention two things that have been are a real problem that we face, whatever we're organizing, and it's the NGOization of the movement, of the grassroots movement, which has definitely happened a lot with domestic workers organizations, you know, with little projects and grants coming in and this and that. Before you know it, you have some NGO that's really running the organization. And also trade unions, on the one hand, not supporting domestic workers' campaigns, and Lady was very struck how at the ILO convention, how difficult it was to get the trade unions who were there to actually speak up in favor of the convention. And they did a lot of lobbying and going and screaming at people and saying, well, you're supposed to be the head of the CGTP and the whatever, you're saying nothing. You know, and she was really outraged about the trade unions, because also her trade union, her domestic workers trade union is also part of another federation I'm leaving. And the bureaucratization that trade unions have brought into the organizing, because you know, when they started their trade union, they had 13 posts for people. They didn't even have 13 members. And then you have people just fighting for position, you know, before you've even decided what campaigning you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And that is really a big problem that we all face. Thank you.
That's great. Okay. The second speaker is Pat Albright. a domestic worker herself and a welfare rights campaigner.
Hello,
Philadelphia.
I wanted to say a little bit about how I got into doing domestic work in the first place.
Speak up, Pat, speak up.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just wanted to say something about how I got involved in domestic work in the first place, which is that I am a college dropout. I came to Philadelphia my freshman year of college because I wanted to do an independent study and got involved in anti-war organizing. Ended up dropping out of school and decided that there was no career I wanted at the university, and I needed a way to support myself because it wasn't something my parents necessarily were pleased about, that I had dropped out and I was trying to survive and do organizing work as full-time as possible. So domestic work was one of the few things I could find to do. So I did domestic work, for a couple of years, and then I took a short break to work in a factory for 2 years as making disco lights, which dates me a little bit too, disco lights. And then after I got laid off of that, which was one of the happiest days of my life, I got unemployment. And then from unemployment, I got on welfare, and I'll say more about the welfare end in a minute. But when you get on welfare, that you end up with, you really can't survive on that. And so you had a little bit of money, which is a big help. And it helped me to do spend most of my time organizing, but I still had to supplement. And a lot of women who are getting benefits have to supplement in some way or another because you really can't survive on the money they give you, even less. Well, now it's a different situation. We'll get into that in a moment. But I've had, so since then, I've been working part-time doing domestic work on my own with people that I know and so on and so forth. But you are very vulnerable, and you don't get paid. You don't have much power to negotiate and so on. And I looked up online here about what was won here in New York, and I just wanted to bring. Is anyone here from any of the domestic worker groups here in New York by any chance?
Oh yes.
Oh, okay, great.
Oh well.
Great. So obviously you'll be able to say more in the discussion, which is really great that you're here. And so but I did look up online, and you can correct me if I got something wrong here, but what was won here with the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And some of the things won here were the right to overtime pay at time and a half after 40 hours of work in a week, a day of rest, 24 hours every 7 days. That doesn't seem like too much to ask for, right? 3 paid days of rest each year after 1 year of work for the same employer, and protection under the New York State human rights law, and creation of a special cause for action for I can't read my phone here, but to deal with domestic violence and assault and so on, I think it is. Yeah, or racial harassment. So anyway, so that was a very significant thing you all won here in New York, that we can talk more about later, since I'm sure you can tell us more about that. And so when I was on, since I want to move over to the welfare, so I know I don't have a whole lot of time, but to say that, a similar way that your work is not recognized and you're invisible actually I wanted to say one thing about being a domestic worker, which is I was interested to find out how much as a domestic worker was very much like being a housewife, because my employers often use me as a therapist, and there's various other ways that are really part of the job that really would cost. If I really got paid for the kind of work I actually did, I would have been paid quite a lot more. Anyway, but anyway, so in the same way as mothers, and I'm the mother of a son who's now 22. He's black, and so anyway, there's a whole. I can also relate to a lot of issues that we talked about in other workshops, like mass incarceration and how they target youth of color, and all. But as a single mom, your work as a mother. My son is 22, but my work has not ended, and the work is very, very difficult. And yet, if you're on welfare, you're seen as a moocher or a scrounger, right now, what we're up against is that welfare reform was passed in 1996, which took away our entitlement to any benefits, which made it basically a work program, and forced mothers to take strike-breaking jobs, put their kids in daycare as young as 6 weeks old, and many women have ended up in prison, homeless, and so on. It's basically devastated our communities. But right now, we have a chance to turn that around. And actually, and my time is almost up?
No, 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. But I wanted to say briefly that one thing that really is very upsetting about the welfare reform, among other things, is how it has started to, kind of brand us, who are welfare recipients, as moochers, grounders, as if we're not contributing to society, and so on. And whereas I had the good fortune of meeting some of the leaders of the welfare rights movement of the 60s and 70s, who are very, very strong women, who are very much against the war in Vietnam, who were very outspoken. And I remember going to a conference, and actually we can't get into all this now, but in Houston, Texas, we had worked together with welfare mothers to pass a decision, or whatever it was called, that mothers on welfare should have the dignity of that money being called a wage and not welfare, was not charity. And that I remember I was very well trained in this, when working with what was then the Wages for Housework campaign, of listening to what the welfare mothers had to say. So in a workshop, I remember seeing some academics who were talking about what was happening with welfare, and we were all looking at it, scratching our heads, what are they talking about? And a mother stood up and she said, they're taking our money. And that's all they had to do. That's all they had to do. They're taking our money. So with the welfare reform, they've taken away our entitlement. They've broken the backs of the movement. I mean, they tried to break the backs of the movement. They tried to undermine the kind of leadership that we used to be able to get more easily from women who are on welfare, because they could be more visible and they weren't stuck rushing from job to job. So so let me just say that right now we have a chance to turn the situation around with welfare reform. With as was mentioned earlier, the Rise Out of Poverty Act. And I want to credit the welfare warriors who really pushed Gwen Moore in Milwaukee to get this bill put forward. It's an opportunity we haven't had, and we want to seize this opportunity and begin to reestablish our entitlement, which the bill would do. Just very briefly, it would focus on ending child poverty rather than caseload reduction or pushing women off the rolls as soon as possible. It would increase benefits and make it would allow for refusing strike-breaking jobs. It would end the lifetime ban for people who have drug felony convictions, and allow you to stay home with every child after 12 months of age rather than once in a lifetime, among other things. So we're urgently looking for people to endorse this petition that's going around, or will go around in a minute, and as organizations, as well as especially to sign online. And there's a link on the petition for how you go online so you can register. We can use those online petition signatures to be very, very helpful to us. And also to please include this issue on your agendas when you go to meetings and so on, that this is an important issue that relates to all the things we'll be discussing here at this forum, yet it wasn't mentioned last night. So thank you all for coming.
The next speaker, I just want to make 2 comments. One of them is that while the welfare reform was going through, while the money was being taken away from women, while the movement of women for that money was being attacked brutally, we heard little or nothing from those who are officially the feminists. They had nothing to say. Many of them were in NGOs which were going to help women who left welfare to, quote, find a job, as if all the work that they had been doing, including the work of dealing with poverty, that's a big job and takes a lot of time in the mind and in the body. They weren't there to be of any use. The second thing is that the petition, I should have said this earlier, is a weapon for building a movement, which is our first and, in fact, in a way, only concern, because the movement will, when it takes off, will solve all our little problems. Okay, our next speaker is Nancy Carroll, community activist, Every Mother is a Working Mother, Philadelphia.
My name is Nancy Carroll. I joined welfare rights in 1970 along with Roxanne Jones. She was the one started it, and she asked me to come in and help her organize it. So I did. And we worked, and then we had to go to Harrisburg, and we had to get up on the table. She persuaded me to get up on the table with her to kick the door in. So we got up there, and she was kicking on the door, and I was getting back because I didn't want to go to jail. So they came out and said, if you kick the door one more time, you're going to jail. So she kicked it again and again and again. So we went to jail. So we stayed in jail, I guess, about 2 hours before they came and got us. Probably that long. But at the time, it was important that that bill got passed, not swept under the table like they do a lot of bills that's for the benefit of poor peoples. And it was just nice. I enjoyed it. That's it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Pat Gowens from Milwaukee, the Welfare Warriors.
Welfare Warriors. And we publish a newspaper called the Mother Warrior's Voice. Mother Warrior's Voice, and you'll all get a copy before you go. We kind of piggybacked off of the welfare rights movement. We started up in 1986. And also sought the four mothers who'd been kicking in doors and doing a lot of physical, took over the Capitol in Wisconsin for longer than this later movement took over the Capitol. And also took over big stores, big hotels, because the mothers would go into these places and say, well, oh, we don't have any money for a clothing allowance, after they took all the clothes off the hangers and just caused mayhem all over. Same thing with housing. Oh, we don't have any money for housing, and they'd go into the really fanciest hotels in the city. So they were our four mothers. We started up, we wanted to create media to let people know that, as you said, that moms on welfare aren't, we always say, lazy, loose liars and sluts. But you're nicer, you have nicer. Anyhow. So the war on the poor, of course, welfare all is about the war on the poor, and all wars prey on a people to steal their resources, okay? So people would say, well, how could they steal from the poor? What do the poor have? I always used to say, how can they do that? But what they steal, of course, the resources in terms of the welfare moms and the low-wage workers, they steal our labor and our children. So there's two resources that we have, which is production and reproduction. And it's very important, actually. We do produce the majority of the children for the countries. And so once welfare reform came in, how did they make money off of this? It became a giant, privatized, multinational, worldwide effort to do the work, what it's called welfare to work program. Very lucrative program, money that used to go into the hands of mothers to get an education, to take care of your kids, to stay home, instead is going now into the pockets of multinationals around the country and around the world. So for instance, Goodwill is one of the companies of, billionaire corporation, know Goodwill, they have the used clothing. The Goodwill makes money now by buying up welfare contracts all over the world. All over. The YWCA buys up contracts, welfare contracts all over the world. Our welfare in Milwaukee is completely privatized. Cash benefits are no longer paid out by a government worker who's just prejudiced. Now it's by a privatized college graduate worker who's prejudiced and greedy. That's the danger. If you combine prejudice and greed, you have the new millennium slavery. That's what the moms call it in terms of the new millennium slavery. Now, the reason that we're calling it slavery, it's more than just a forced work program. The mothers have to work 30 hours a week for no pay in any type of work activity, unpaid work activities. Of course, if you get paid work, you'll be off of welfare. But in order to get your tiny grant, which again is not minimum wage and not protected by minimum wage, just like almost all the mother work that we do, domestic workers have never been protected by minimum wage, farm workers, waitresses, food workers. And so the welfare grants, no matter what size, you're required to do 30 hours of work activities. So for instance, in Milwaukee, women work in the school system, they work in the Head Start systems, all for free. They work in the welfare systems, they work in the nonprofit systems, all for no pay. And imagine how much money is going into the hands. The figures are phenomenal. The minute welfare reform passed, we went from having, in Wisconsin, we went from paying about $500 million a year for 90,000 mothers with children. And within a year, once it was privatized and all these private corporations just said, no, you can't have any money. No, we can't give you money. Go to your family, go to your church, go to work, go get something else. And so at that point, the rolls in Wisconsin dropped from 90,000 to 10,000. And this is true in Georgia. Now, most of the other states, it went down about half or 2/3. So, and the money went up. Now, remember, we're in a period of austerity, right? We just can't afford public benefits, social services. Well, we can for the wealthy, because now, instead of just spending $500 million a year, we're spending $750 for 1/10 as many people. And in terms of the federal, we went from spending $5 billion for 5 million moms with children down to only 2 million moms with children, and we're up to about $6 billion. So there seems to be money always for the wealthy, and it's a war on the poor, and it's a very lucrative thing. I want to explain a little bit more. After the 30 hours of no pay, which the moms called new millennium slavery, think about it. If you can find any job anywhere within any radius of your city, you're going to take it to avoid working for no pay. So you will take any job anywhere for any pay. And this is what, of course, would cause minimum wage not to be raised for 10 years. The Congress did not raise minimum wage for 10 years after welfare reform passed because they didn't have to. They had millions of mothers forced to take any job for any pay, anywhere. So that was for 10 years. You know, this was part of the whole neoliberal attack on workforce. So in terms of the privatization, Maximus, Goodwill, all over the world, they buy up these contracts. The Prime Minister's wife in Australia bought up the welfare to work contract and became, over 2 years, became a multimillionaire. In Israel, Maximus and a private Netherlands company took over what used to be a guaranteed family support program, and they took it over, turned it into a welfare program exactly based on Wisconsin. In fact, they called it the Wisconsin Plan. And they called their center the Wisconsin Center. And of course, it preyed on the poor, primarily Arab families. In Israel, they beat it. They're actually the only country that we've heard of that beat it. They had groups working and combining in the streets, in the courts, and in the legislatures. And they had huge protests together with us in Milwaukee. In fact, we joined together. And they actually wiped out the Wisconsin Plan. It no longer exists in Israel. So finally, the other part about how they make money off of our children is, of course, since welfare reform passed, there's even more children now being illegally taken from their homes, which is a huge job creation program, a multi-billionaire, $30 billion empire in the United States, illegally taking children from the poor to use them both for trafficking and to the suburbs for adoption, and to use them for 13 levels of professionals to get paid to provide mandatory conditions, therapy, lawyers, judges, nonprofits, visitation supervisors, etc. So that the war on the poor has become even more deadly and more dangerous, and actually more scary. Finally, we did get the goodwill in Milwaukee off of welfare. They had an $87 million contract, and our organization stood in front of their offices, and because they needed a good reputation in order to sell and get donations, you know, they're always on the dole, they actually gave up their $87 million contract in Wisconsin, which was great. And we also got our Congresswoman Gwen Moore to introduce the RISE bill, which she was a mom on welfare herself, so she's very empathetic and understanding about, you know, the need for support for families. And this RISE bill would make it better, certainly not perfect, but it would be a better system and wouldn't be as deadly. Because right now we have 8 million moms and children living with zero income in the United States because time limits. Not only do you have to work for no pay, but after 2, 3, depending on the state, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you're off for life and you have no money whatsoever. All you get is food stamps. Finally, the last thing I want to say is we are, the Welfare Warriors have called for an international day to protest the war on the poor, commemorate and protest, and I shouldn't say commemorate, for July 15th. And we want the first annual International Day to Stop the War on the Poor to be this July 15th of this year. We called for this last August, so we're asking you all to think of this and get involved.
We'll talk about that later, shall we?
All right, I'm done.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Sam Weinstein, trade unionist from Payday.
Well, Pat made the connection between welfare.
Which Pat?
Pat Gowens, sorry, made the connection between wages and welfare very well. I'm going to expand that hopefully a little bit. I wanted to start off with, well, first to say that Payday, without giving a long description about Payday, just to say that our slogan is refusing to kill is not a crime. And so one of the things that we're always after is the military budget. And I wanted to put a couple of facts into play which go towards that end. You may know a lot of these already. The top 400 wealthiest people in the United States are worth $2 trillion and rising. $2 trillion is a lot of money. The top 1%, Selma referred to the 99% and the 1%. The top 1% constitute approximately 3.2 million people, so 400 constitute 0.000001% of the population. In practice, if you can believe this, and this is the amazing figure to me, in practice, 61 US billionaires were not rich enough to make the top 400. They didn't count, right? The top 20% own 89% of all the wealth, right? Almost 9 times the total wealth of the bottom 80%. I mean, we've heard a lot in this country about the differentiation, how there's a gap going on, but it's very difficult to even conceive of what that gap looks like. And if we go to the military budget in the United States in 2011 was approximately $1 trillion, right? And I want to compare that with what was spent on TANF, the welfare program, which was approximately, and Pat Gowens' figure of 6 million is what's actually getting paid out, but the total budget for TANF is approximately 19 billion. That means that the military budget, in comparison to what's being paid for welfare, is 50 to 1. They are spending 50 times as much in the business of killing people as they are into the business of caring for people. And those to me are tremendous figures. And along with that, as Pat pointed out, wages have in fact dropped. For all men, and this is just men we're talking about here, average income has declined by 28% in the 40 years from 1969 to 2009. Wages have dropped 28%. Right. It goes without saying that women's wages are much lower than men's, and people of color's wages much less than white men's. These gaps have only grown greater during the recent recession. Right. The destruction of welfare as we know it, which is what they said at the time, what Clinton advertised so boldly, hastened also the collapse of something else which they weren't talking about, but which was a state-by-state program, which was general assistance, it was called in some states. And interestingly enough, general assistance was mainly populated by men. There were some women, if you were a single woman without kids, you were on general assistance, Pat was on general assistance. It was all you had to keep you from being destitute. 15% of all welfare recipients were on GA. That was wiped out, essentially wiped out in almost every single state by the destruction of welfare. I mean, now there is literally nothing. If you're destitute, and that's it. Which is why, among other things, we have so many people on the streets, etc., etc. But, you know, when you see this playing out, sometimes it's amazing how it plays out. Because in Michigan, they literally, on one day, when they did away with GA, they took away all the income from 80,000 people on one day. Just wiped it out. Those people had no more money. That was it. And the concrete result of that was a general decrease in wages of 4% within the next year or two, and 6% for women in particular. At the lower end, it really, you know, killed wages. And 4 and 6% don't sound like a lot, but when cost of living is going up and all the rest of that, and your wages are actually going in the other direction, what you're talking about is a huge amount. Those are really, that's whether or not you can pay the rent or turn the heat on, which in Michigan is a tough business. 3 minutes and I'm off. As a result, we have also had the poverty draft. If people don't have wages, then they do something else. They go into the military, etc., etc. And the other thing I wanted to say, because I am from a union, one of the Pat Gowens pointed out how wages have dropped. But not only that, when they put people on workfare, they did away with all the protections of the labor standards and various other labor protections which unions have fought for years. And now they have done very little. They did state that they were opposed to welfare reform, but they have frankly done very little to protect it. And therefore they have done very little to protect their own members, frankly. I mean, it has really been a disaster. I wanted to mention 2 other things briefly. One is that I've just said something about the unions, but there are some exceptions to that rule. And one of them was a guy named Bob Crow in Britain who signed the petition about welfare, and although he represented a set of workers just like the workers that I used to represent, relatively well paid, right? He always knew that his members depended on what happened at the bottom.
That's right.
And as a result, he signed that petition that Selma was talking about, and he was always stood on the side of those who had least. The last point I want to make is part of what I did when I was a trade union official was I fought very hard for pay equity, and we actually won the largest pay equity settlement in private industry in the United States at Southern California Gas Company. Some women got as much as 27%, and we got the largest classification of women, the women who answered the telephones at the gas company, onto the same pay rate as the men, the largest classification of men who worked out in the field, which was a phenomenal thing to have won, right? And we did it with the help of the campaign among other things. We made sure that we had community support, and we got that. A lot of that support was organized by the campaign.
The Wages for House.
The Wages for House campaign, sorry. Yeah. But the real point I wanted to make about that is that when they did the analysis, we fought hard for a particular company which had some credibility to do the survey on which the pay equity was built. And when we did that, when we got them to do that survey, one of the things that became apparent is that group of women in that big classification were multitasking all the time. That's part of what they were doing, and the individual tasks didn't look like much, but they were doing it all and controlling it and acting as the shock absorbers for the gas company when people called up to complain about their bill and all the rest. In other words, they were just like housewives, right? And so my last point, domestic workers, which Pat Albright mentioned and so on, if you begin to count the work in any realistic way, then you have to go for pay equity, and I like the $15 minimum wage.